on. Hello? It's working now. Good afternoon. No. Hello? Oh, you can hear me. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, delegates, to ESCOM's second session at COP28. Thank you for making the time. I think today's discussion is critical. We're really going to focus on the just element in terms of the transition and working with the communities in terms of that sustainability element. I think from an ESCOM perspective, just that our colleagues can get up to speed of where we are. We as ESCOM have conducted socio-economic impact assessment studies across 10 power stations that has been completed, and that will be built into our just energy transition journey. We've identified opportunities to ensure that we do work with the communities going forward. We've learned a lot of lessons from our experience with the Komati power station. And importantly, if you take into account the South African context in terms of unemployment, as we embark on this just energy transition, we must make sure that we leverage the job creation and the industrial activities in terms of this transition. For example, we as ESCOM have designed containerized microgrids as part of this just energy transition, and we look to be more innovative going forward in conjunction with a number of partners. Today, our panel will consist of a number of speakers and giving us experiences from their countries as well. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Crispian Olver, who will then give his input into the just energy transition, really focusing on the sustainability element. Otherwise, it is not a just transition. So thank you, colleagues. Crispian, over to you. Yeah, and you can sit there.
Thank you very much, and very good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you on this platform. My congratulations to ESCOM for convening this session. I think the work that you're doing is extremely important. I mean, not only are you the national utility in charge of providing power to our industrial economy, but you also have this huge legacy set of assets, coal assets, which you face very difficult choices around. How to transition out of them, when to transition out of them, how to repurpose and repower them. And you've not shied away from many of the difficult decisions and choices involved in that process. You also are in charge of the transmission grid for the country. And everyone knows that the transmission grid is the bottleneck to scaling up renewable and other generation technologies. Just going by your own transmission development plan, there's some 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines that have to be built. And that's a massive undertaking, particularly with the kind of constrained balance sheet that you're operating under. So, you know, you play fundamental roles in terms of energy access, in terms of energy security, and in terms of our country's decarbonization process. You know, the bulk of our emissions are in the energy sector. We have one of the most energy and emissions intensive power systems in the world, if not the most. And it is a competitive disadvantage as we move into this new world order. We've watched, for instance, the European Union come out with their carbon border adjustment mechanism. We've seen countries such as the US with their Inflation Reduction Act heavily subsidizing a whole raft of technologies. We're seeing other countries line up to make their own border adjustment or equivalent mechanisms, the UK, Australia. Pretty much, anyone that's taking on ambitious mitigation targets is wanting to do that. So, we're fighting these mechanisms. We think they are unilateral. We think they do not take account of the principle of common but differentiated responsibility in these negotiations. But in one form or another, we're seeing a carbon price get injected into the global economy. And if we're not proactive and careful, we're going to find ourselves outcompeted in terms of global trade and left with a highly uncompetitive economy. So, one of the big things South Africa and South African businesses become aware of is the risks of not decarbonizing fast enough. We're also acutely aware of the risks of decarbonizing too fast. So we have some 80,000 workers employed in the coal value chain. We've got about 100,000 workers employed in the auto sector. We've got a huge number of workers, over 100,000 in petrochemicals, Sasol's operations. And if we go too rapidly, we're going to liquidate those sectors before we've built out alternative livelihoods. So calibrating the pace of this transition is extremely important for us as a country. We've got to get the pace of transition right, or we're going to cause economic, on both sides, we're going to cause economic and social devastation and wind back many of the development gains that we've won as a country so far on our pathway. And that's why we talk about a just transition. For us, a just transition has to be equitable globally, so at a north-south level, and it has to be equitably nationally. And that means that people that are most at risk in this transition, and by that I mean people employed in the sectors I've described, communities that are at risk from devastating climate change and the effects of a warming world on water security, food security, basic services, infrastructure. It's the poorest that are most at risk. Most of us in the middle class, we've got assets. We can weather a crisis or two. If necessary, we can move. We've got networks to draw on. But it's people without those assets, without those infrastructures and incomes and buffers that, when crisis hits, it's devastating. It tips them permanently into a state of poverty and they never recover from it. So for us, we talk in South Africa about three principles. We want distributive justice, which means that the risks and opportunities have to be shared fairly, and those that are most responsible for the problem need to carry the burden. We talk about restorative justice, which means that degraded land, degraded air sheds and water catchments need to be rehabilitated. And for people that have been disadvantaged in this transition, they need to be restored. And we talk about procedural justice. So it's not just about doing the right thing and making sure that we, deal with the distributive issues I've spoken about, but we need to involve people that are most at risk in decisions about this transition. At the moment, people on the ground in South Africa feel that there's some elite up there making decisions and that they're not in control. And that's a very important thing we need to take account of. If we ignore that perception and that feeling at our peril. So, the big things we've got to do if we want to make sure this transition's just is invest in economic diversification, put the skills in place that equip the labor force for the nature of work tomorrow, grow out the value chains, so renewables, batteries, the move to new energy vehicles, the move into minerals for the future green economy. These are all sectors where there are huge opportunities, but we can't take a laissez-faire approach to it. We've got to actively grow out those sectors. And then we've got to find a way of mobilizing the finance that then supports all of this. And we've seen a significant uptick in the in the flow of climate finance. So if you read our latest climate finance landscape report, we're now averaging about 130 billion rands per annum flowing into mitigation and adaptation sectors. Most of it into mitigation. So mitigation's not doing badly, but we need 3 to 4 times what we currently mobilizing in terms of finance. And we need to channel a lot more of it into adaptation and into just transition aspects of this transition. So one of the things we've been doing as a climate commission is looking at the financing mechanisms we need to get money to flow into just transition sectors. So I'm going to leave it at that and hand over to other members of the panel.
Thanks for that, Crispian. We're now going to hand over to our colleague from the Indonesian JET program, Adityani Putri. She's a specialist and engagement manager in their JET transition. So we look forward to hearing their experiences of what they've encountered in Indonesia. Welcome.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here to share our experience in Indonesia, especially because we are, when it comes to the JETP universe, we are the younger sibling, right? So we are looking at South Africa. We're looking to you like, we look to an older sibling. And I remember having had a meeting with the JET IP team, with some members of the JET IP team in Vikesh at the very, very start of our journey. And we thought, as I mentioned before the session, we were probably about a month or two into the process of putting our investment plan together. We did not even have our full team, recruited at that time, but we had some of the processes started already. And we thought we had figured it out, we thought we had mapped out all the challenges, and we thought, okay, the just transition component is just going to be that. And so it was just one color. And then throughout the journey, it became like a burst of fireworks with a rainbow right in the end. And we still haven't gotten to the very end of that rainbow, to the pot of the gold at the end of the rainbow, meaning we haven't figured it out at all. We feel like the more we unpack this, the more things we know that we don't know. So I guess I want to start with that before I go through the slides describing how we were thinking about just transition, but it is very much consistent and aligned with what you've just mentioned. So if we could perhaps show the other slides, not the ESCOM slides. Oh, I see. How do I skip to my slides, though? All right. Okay. So I'm probably going to move towards here so I can see my own slides. So the Indonesian JETP joint statement was issued in November 22. But we really only started on the journey on putting together the investment plan. And in the Indonesian context, we called it the Comprehensive Investment and Policy Plan. To this point, we don't know why we called it the Comprehensive Plan, because of course, even if you've written over 300 pages of something that is called, it will never be comprehensive, right? So what we really ended up with in the end was the first chapter of probably a 10-volume, a 10-volume encyclopedia. So we started with specific targets, ambitions laid out in the joint statement, but we wanted to make sure that the CIPP, as we call it, not the IP, in the Indonesian context it's the CIPP, which focuses only on the power sector, so this is what makes it different to the South African one. We wanted to be abiding to these three principles, right? That it lays out a trajectory for ambitious emissions reduction that is conditional. Why? Because it is conditional upon the financing and the technical assistance promised in the joint statement. We also wanted it to contain a significant penetration of renewable energy, because this is really about diversifying the generation base of the generation mix of Indonesia, and we wanted it to have a plan to accelerate the net zero target of the power sector. However, it needs to align with the four principles. First of all, contributing positively to the Indonesian economy, bearing in mind that we are a nation that is fast growing and that our electricity demand is going to grow quite significantly over the years, guaranteeing energy security and stability whilst ensuring a just transition. We will explain later what that means in our context. Ensuring the environmental sustainability of those energy choices, but more importantly, because we also only have one single utility, right, in the power sector, we need to maintain long-term financial sustainability for PLN. That is also the other principle that we went by as we wrote up the plan. And so this is all contingent upon mobilization of actually not just capital, but also technical support that was promised in the joint statement, and also a combination of approaches that were alluded to in the joint statements. So we set out to write the CIPP, and finally, a week ago, on the 21st of November, just before, packing our bags to go to the COP, we managed to launch it, which meant that we had wrapped up all the technical process, producing the analysis, producing the pathway, but also we managed to wrap up the consultative process, right, underpinning the CIPP. And now we've entered the implementation phase. So what had we written in there regarding just transition? Basically, we figured out quite early on, because the just transition element was very much introduced in the beginning to us as enhanced form of safeguarding. But then we realized that it's not just safeguarding. It really is about driving growth, so economic transformation and diversification. It is not just about compensating workers who will be out of jobs because of coal phase out, coal phase down, infrastructure changes, but it is also about introducing new economy, new local economy, introducing even new industries. So this is what we had figured out along as we were on the journey in completing the CIPP. And so what we've also realized that there is a just transition elements in all 5 investment areas. So in the Indonesian CIPP, even though the most dominant narrative regarding JETP in Indonesia is that of coal phase out, but we have actually 5 investment areas in our CIPP. The first one is the development of the transmission network, The second one is the early retirement of the coal power plants or the managed phased out. And then the third one is the accelerated development of dispatchable renewable energy. In our context is hydro and geothermal. And also to some parts, there is also biomass-based energy, but not a lot. And the fourth investment area, and the reason why we've separated it because of their distinctive features, the second one is variable renewable energy. And the fifth one is the development of renewable energy supply chain. So there is just transition interventions required in these all 5 investment areas. However, I have to add that in Indonesia, the narrative around just transition in the media space and the civil society space is really overly hyper-focused on the second investment area at the moment. It is not advancing to all of the other investment areas in the way that it is talked about and discussed. And I think there is an element of the attention of the trade unions is overly fixated on investment area number 2, when in fact in the CIPP, we have only, so in the CIPP we have 3 power sector scenarios. And the second one, which we had dubbed the most viable one, or the JETP power sector pathway, only has 2 power plants that is planned to be phased out in the plan. So the impact will be not as big as predicted before. In the initial, when we set out on the JETP journey, we thought that to hit the targets, we would need to phase out around 5 to 8 gigawatts, but in the end, we had to adjust it to the financing that was available. And it was identified that the financing that was available under the 11.5 billion USD public finance component can only cater to phasing out 2 coal power plants at this point. So there was no use to support or overly expand on the more ambitious plan when it comes to the second investment area, not when with expanding on the other investment area, especially the accelerated RE component, we would still be able to get to the emissions reductions target, right? And potentially generate more socioeconomic benefits that way. So just to go into like granularity, right? We thought that, okay, so just transition, let's figure out what the principles would be, what are the foundations. So the way we've kind of like structured the thinking, the framework around just transition is as such that we are basically building on the principles that Indonesia had signed on to already, based on all of the international conventions that Indonesia has had already signed on to, on human rights, on gender equality and empowerment, the ECOSOC convention, etc. So in the foundations, these are very much rights of the community, rights of the individuals, rights of citizens that have already been acknowledged by the Constitution, and the Constitution is mandated to protect these rights. And then more specifically, the just transition in the energy context, we have devised 2 kind of like pillars guiding the implementation of just transition. The first one is leave no one behind, no communities, no audience groups, right? And this also concerns social groups. So in the just transition discussion, we often think of vulnerable, we focus on vulnerable communities for the right part, right? Justifiably so, local communities. But there are also elements, local governments, for example, are also deserving of our attention because they will actually lose out on local revenue coming from fossil fuel-based economies, right? Currently in Indonesia, for example, there are 3 provinces that live off the rents from fossil fuel, not just extraction, but also production, and also to some extent, the whole trade around it, right? So the logistics, the supply chain. So that's one of the things that kind of like characterizes pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is environmental sustainability, but also that of community resilience in facing, just as Crispian mentioned, the shocks that will come with accelerated energy transition, because JETP is designed to be ambitious. The acceleration the pace at which development needs to happen will be unprecedented. The pace at which land has to be acquired, right? For transmission lines, communities have to be displaced for mega renewable energy projects will be, massively accelerated, and that will bring a lot of shocks. Even though at the very end, we all desire for benefits to occur, accumulated, and to be distributed, but there will be a lot of growing pains, right? So that's the other pillar that guides us in our thinking. And then as a result, we thought, okay, so there are already, ambitious standards, safeguarding standards applied by the likes of the IFC, the lenders, etc., right? And they extend to what you see here, standard number 1 to 8, right? These are all the typical safeguarding standards. So we thought, why don't we introduce a 9th standard that would be focusing on the economic diversification and transformation piece. So just to give a bit of context, the Secretariat in writing the Just Transition chapter is aided by the Just Transition Working Group that is led by UNDP. And we had members in there from ILO, from the International Labour Organization, and also from GIZ, from the ADB, and also, from the World Bank, and also from a local organization, the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law. And they had reached a consensus whereby let's introduce a 9th standard, and this was discussed in a consultative process with the Indonesian government and the IPG and accepted to be a part of the CIPP. So we're very much at the start of the journey where this 9th standard really needs to be developed much, much further and introduced to the lenders especially as a new standard that needs to be featured in when they do their safeguarding assessment. They also need to do the assessment. The project developers will also need to do the assessment for the 9th standard. But there's still a lot of unknowns that needs to be figured out here. Now, let me just elaborate here. So here, these are the standards, 1 to 8 is basically the business as usual, if you will, standards that need to be applied when a project developer applies to a potential lender. And in this case, we're talking about the 11.5 public finance that will flow through the various intermediaries. They will all ask for these types of standards, referring to the ADB environmental safeguards, for example, or the IFC standards, right? And the private sector, the private finance, for example, will also have their own ESG frameworks. The standard 1 to 8 kind of like conforms to already the safeguards that are out there, and we are trying to scale the standards to the strictest or the most ambitious standards that will be applied in this context. So there will be the assessment stage where 1 to 8 will be conducted as per business as usual, because as you all know, in the end of the day, in terms of how the financing drawdown is done, it is really business as usual, right? You go into the different financiers, right? And then see, and this is very much part of the process of locking in, right, your financing. And the standard number 9th will also need to be conducted at the assessment stage. And then afterwards, you go into at the project level. And then afterwards, you go into the intervention stage, where in the assessment, it will result in a set of interventions that need to be done at the project level and will become the project developer's responsibility. And if we want to be candid, will burden, right, the project financing. Now, but then there is a proportion of that will fall under the responsibility of others, national governments, local governments, right? And this cannot be burdened to the project financing because you cannot inflate the financing as such so that the project cannot continue. Now, this is where the gap lies. So the assessment, yes, that can be done. And of course, we can try to raise funding, right, grant funding, to support the expansion of the assessment. 1 to 8 should technically be done by the project developers themselves. It is technically BAU, right? But what about number 9? Okay, let's raise financing for that, right? Let's raise grant funding for that to send consultants to do the assessment. But the question is intervention. Who's going to pay for the national and subnational component? Ideally, that should not be the project financing part, right? That should be public finance flowing to subnational governments, national governments. And because the standards here may be, we don't have a slide here that shows, the standards here will be definitely beyond what national regulation requires, right, in terms of, say, responsibility towards rejuvenating local economy with the accelerated change, or for example, in terms of going above and beyond, setting extra vocational training, right, to meet the increased needs, the rapidly increase of needs for certain technical skills, right, in the purpose of economic diversification and transformation. That means that because it is way beyond what the national regulation requires, then there should be a responsibility of the IPG nations in the JETP context, or in this case, the global north, right, to step in and help, right, in terms of mobilizing the financial resources and the technical resources to do so. The use of the state budget can only be justified as far as what the national regulation allows. Yes, over time, we should be reforming national regulations, right, to advance and enhance, right, and integrate just transition into national regulations, national curriculums, national standards. But before we wait for that, there is a need to address this in the short term. Now, let us jump to the financing bit, right? Because I've spoken about mobilizing financial resources. And in reality, what we have discovered in the process of identifying the financial resources available for JETP Indonesia, we have found that the grant financing makes up a relatively small proportion of the total financing committed, right? Sounds familiar to all of you, right? And what we've also found that the grant financing, some of them already allocated, those allocated to just transition is abysmally small, right? And also there is, funnily enough, loans designated for just transition. And this created a question like, why should we be paying back for support for just transition, right? This also raised a question mark, for example, in the view of the Indonesian government. So we have this slide to point out that the just transition component of this will actually require a lot more financing, even though that financing has not been identified yet fully. At least for the assessment of 41 super priority projects that have been identified in the CIPP, we would need 41 times 500 million, for example, or 150 million. Whatever consultants cost these days, right? To, do assessment for lenders, right? Internationally reputable consultants, right? You know what their price tags are like. So these are the things that we know, we have an idea, but then there's a lot more that we don't have idea. We still have to figure out, and that would be the financing for the just transition component. However, we know that it needs to be grant financing to a large extent, and this is definitely not cutting it. So we have written here that support will be particularly impactful, and that would come at all levels of the just transition aspect. Figuring out the framework, how to operationalize the framework by mapping specific steps required for each type of stakeholders, right? Project developers, subnational governments, national governments, within each investment area, within key projects, at least within the 41 top priority projects identified. The second one is implementing and measuring economic diversification and transformation. Everyone wants a nice KPI, right? So how do we do that? How do we develop this approach for implementing the Standard 9 within project developers, including baseline assessment, etc.? None of the, consultants domestically in Indonesia, they still have to be trained on it. They have to figure out how to do that in the context of just energy transition. Third is to understand the just transition impacts of the pathways that we have designed, the power sector pathways. That still needs to be figured out. Develop an M&E strategy. And then finally, the funding, how to do it in a sustainable way. Whether it is a combination of national, state budget resources, or a new levy, a new taxation, combination of fiscal intervention, in combination with international grants that can flow in a sustainable way, bilateral, multilateral commitments. These are the things that still needs figuring out, and this is why I keep saying that we are very much at the start of the journey, especially when it comes to figuring out the just transition component. I think I spoke over time, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adityani. It was really Caleb was right. It is difficult to hear, so I'm not sure if I am audible. I think I may be. But thank you so much. That was fantastic. It was really great that you could share your insights from the Indonesian perspective. We really appreciate that. We do have a few slides as well from an ISCOM perspective, and we will get into our plenary shortly. So I'm not going to focus on the presentation. It's more to set the scene. So we are looking at a just energy transition, and it's quite critical that we emphasize just. And there are common themes that come across in all our conversations, and that is in terms of economic diversification, skills development, continuation of economic activity, second life of power stations. And we've had these discussions over the last several days, and it's quite repeated, and it's quite a common message as well. We have mentioned our principles associated with our just energy transition, and the first one is to decouple our repurposing and repowering initiatives from station decommissioning schedules. And we've had those discussions. What's important for today's engagement is how do we make our transition just, especially in an emerging market like ours, where we haven't contributed a significant amount in terms of global emissions. However, we face the brunt of the challenges, and we face the actual real problems associated with climate change. So we have quite a distinguished panel today, and I'm not, as I've indicated, I'm not going to go through these slides in any level of detail, other than these are the power stations that we've identified for our repurposing and repowering initiatives. The bulk of them are in a single province called Mpumalanga. The eventual station shutdown will result in significant impact on economic activity, and there is a need for us to pursue a just energy transition. This is an indication of the progress that has been made in the recent past regarding, firstly, the Komati training facility. That's the progress that we've made. While we continue to establish the permanent facility, we have started community engagements, we've started training of the ESCOM staff around introduction to renewables, community soft skills training, solar PV installer and mounting courses that are already happening at Komati Power Station. Importantly, community soft skills development, because an important part of the transition is equity. Treat each community or provide bespoke solutions that are suitable for that specific community. And in our engagement with Komati, soft skills, things like presentation skills, negotiation skills, contract management, general soft skills came out as a need from that community. And the ESCOM Academy of Learning, together with the South African Renewable Energy Technology Center, developed programs that we utilize to offer these training courses. And we've received positive feedback from community members regarding that training. There's a lot of training that's still planned in the near future. We've also progressed with the completion of the construction of the agrivoltaics facility that will feed into the wider provincial initiative regarding agricultural training, and the center will be used as an incubator to establish SMMEs around agricultural activities. Importantly, we are progressing with the establishment of a containerized microgrid assembly line facility, and that will be producing containerized microgrids at Komati Power Station. And again, it speaks to the economic diversification. So while we speak about the energy landscape, solar PV, wind, coal as well being a provider of employment, there are opportunities that we have identified at each of our power stations, things like alien vegetation removal that's already underway at Komati, and we have already employed 200 people from the community to do exactly that. That will feed into a subsequent program that we have in place regarding biogas, biodigesters as well. In addition to that, we have identified, we've extended our reach, our R&R initiatives to other power stations. We've advanced with discussions with the Dutch at Crudeplay Power Station to establish a climate-smart agriculture center, greenhouse technology, that assists the Crudeplay community with agricultural activities. And again, the establishment of small, medium, micro enterprises to facilitate that economic diversification and job creation. And then there's a multitude of options available for a just transition. We have an example of a copper recycling facility that we are exploring at Komati Power Station. We have examples of ash beneficiation that we have started development at all of our power stations except for Komati. That doesn't lend itself to that. And to conclude my slides, the opportunities are vast, and the just energy transition presents us with vast opportunities to diversify the economy and to continue with economic activity. With that, I would like to introduce our panel. If I could start with Dr. Crispian Olver, and as I introduce you, you may come up so that we could have a panel discussion. Crispian is the Executive Director for the Presidential Climate Commission, and you've already heard from Crispian. We also have Nkosinati Nkonyane. He's the CEO of the Mpumalanga Green Cluster Agency. Shamini Harrington is Vice President of Climate Change at SASL. And then finally, Tando Lukuko is SA Climate Action Network Coordinator for South Africa. Welcome. I should also ask Adityani, we should have invited you as a panelist, and I would really love to get your insights on the just. So if you are happy to do that, please grab a chair if you want to, and we can engage. We can have a conversation around the just component. Really up to you. But thank you so much for your presentation. No, we can always add a chair. Yeah, but Crispian, we are all here to learn, and it's a learning opportunity for us all. So thank you again. But let's start with Crispian. Since you started the engagements earlier today, the PCC was sharing its framework for a just energy transition in South Africa. Could you enlighten us on the policy initiatives that are currently being pursued to support the objectives of this framework?
Hi, hello?
Yeah,
it is on. Okay, hello again. Really good to be with all of you. So you would have heard Joanne Yarvich and Rudy Dix introducing the JET implementation plan. They have done an incredible amount of work to put the detail on what was originally called a JET-P, the 8.5 billion. It's now morphed a little bit, so we've raised some 12 billion plus from the international partner group that's joined. And the investment plan that they've drawn up, so they've not just looked at what to do with the grant component, they've visualized the entire cost of the energy transition, focusing on electricity, which is principally about upgrading the grid and ramping up renewables, around EVs, which is supporting the auto industry to transition away from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles and new energy vehicles, and then doing some of the early stage investment on the hydrogen side. And then in response to a lot of the comments and criticisms that stakeholders raised, they've also substantially expanded on the just elements of that package. So there's a big investment in skills development. They're talking about focusing on these skills development zones. There's investments in economic diversification linked to many of the power stations and coal mines in Mpumalanga. There's a project clearinghouse mechanism that they're setting up for just transition projects. And there's work going into local government. So many of the electricity sector reforms that we're seeing are also opening up opportunities for a more decentralized power system. And municipalities are embracing that by looking at own generation, wheeling power across their grids, doing net metering with households, implementing feed-in tariffs. So there are new business models starting to emerge at a local government level. And very significantly, there's a whole section of the JET investment plan that focuses on supporting local government in that transition. So it's a very significant package. As the Commission, we've been deeply engaged with that, so we've been supporting them and done a lot of the stakeholder engagement that sits behind the plan. And then there are a couple of areas that, as the Climate Commission, we've been focusing on developing further and building out. So one of them is the long-term mechanism for raising finance for the just transition. We're particularly concerned at the moment. Climate finance tracks finance for mitigation and finance for adaptation. We don't have a mechanism for tracking finance into the just elements of the transition. It's not in the green economy. There's no tagging framework. So we've put forward a set of proposals to stakeholders. The paper's been released. It's on our website today, which argues for a tagging framework for just transition projects, a matchmaking facility that links prospective funders up with projects as they're emerging, and investment in the pipeline. So, many of the projects that we're seeing coming up through the system have not been properly designed. They aren't geared for the financing that is available. So that's one of the areas we've been making recommendations on. The second area we've been particularly interested in is around alternative ownership models for renewable energy. So, the standard model that we've been running, is IPPs. So getting private sector investment into, IPPs structured against long-term 20-year power purchase agreements. If we just do that as the model, we're going to see a wholesale privatization of our electricity system. So as the Commission, we've been quite keen to see publicly owned renewable projects moving forward. Eskom, we think, should be in the renewables game. We also want to see municipalities in the renewables game. But more ambitiously, we'd like to see worker-owned and community-owned renewable energy projects. Is this not working?
It stopped working.
Hello? Hello, hello? Hello? Hello, hello? Hello?
Is mine working?
Well, this is better than nothing.
Yeah, let's continue.
Okay. So yeah, a diverse system of ownership models we think is fundamental to this transition moving forward. I'm not saying don't do private sector investment. I mean, ultimately the bulk of the investment that's going to flow in the energy transition is going to be private sector, but we can't be backing only one model. We want to see a diversity of models emerging. So we've recently put recommendations out there in draft form, and we'd encourage all of you to read them. They're on our website, and we'd love to hear what you have to say about that. The last initiative that we're launching today in this pavilion at 5 o'clock is is it today? Oh, tomorrow. 5 o'clock tomorrow, just before the launch of the pavilion. So there's a cocktail party afterwards. Hopefully that'll get you there. But we're launching our climate finance landscape report, which tracks all of the flows of finance. So there was a previous landscape report covering the years 2017 and 2018. We've now updated that report. So we're giving you an up-to-date picture of all of the flows from source through mechanisms to end use. And it's a report that we're going to be doing on a biennial basis. And we think it's fundamental. If you don't track it, you can't know where we're heading. So that's the third contribution we've made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crispian. And we are competing with some very enthusiastic neighbors. But you mentioned private sector, or the role of private sector, which is a good lead into Chamonix from the private sector yourself. Cecil, what role do you see the private sector playing in driving the adoption of clean energy in a manner that is just, especially in an emerging market like South Africa?
Thanks for that, Vikesh. And a simple answer to that would be a critical role to play. I think, given that we've got such an ambitious NDC, given where we sit as a company, we have a very active key role to play in meeting that NDC or helping the country meet that NDC. Outside of Eskom, Sasol's the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but we also a large employer in the country. We also contribute quite significantly to the GDP. In fact, our contribution to the GDP is about 5%. So in how we transition, we will either have positive or negative impacts on the economy. If done too fast, you are going to seriously impact the economy. If done too slowly, you are going to miss meeting the NDC and actually bringing on board the much needed transition that's needed in the country. So from our perspective, we've actually put in place a transition plan that is tied to the national NDC and helps contribute to achieving it. Our contribution is about 27% to the NDC, so that's a significant contribution. What we are looking at is using existing assets, our Secunda asset, which is a large emitter right now, one facility, 60 million tons. And what we're looking to do is use those existing assets, use energy efficiency, renewable energy, to the maximum that we can bring on board, turning down boilers, reducing the amount of coal we're using, and ultimately getting to a point where we decarbonize while minimizing social and economic impacts. So that was really the fundamental tenet of how we are looking at our transition, particularly in the short to medium term. Post that, we are looking at those large-scale interventions that actually will require us to move significantly from coal, and when you do that, you will have social implications. So what we're trying to do in parallel is also grow the green hydrogen sector. If you grow the green hydrogen sector, we can utilize our existing assets in a very different way. We can contribute to job creation, we can contribute to economic growth, sustainable economic growth, and we can then upskill and reskill people that would have been impacted through the transition into these new areas. So these are the things that we as a corporate have to do. We have a responsibility to do it. It's not just to reduce emissions, it's to do it in the most responsible way. So we've also put in place a just transition roadmap, supporting our emission reduction roadmap. And I was quite struck by the fact that I was in many panels. Not many corporates are thinking that way. It's simply a decarbonization roadmap. How do we move away from high carbon emitting activities to low carbon emitting activities? You've got to also marry that with the social projects as well, community projects, because when you do that, you will impact someone's life. And these are the things that we are looking at. I can go on a lot more, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, hand over to the rest of the colleagues, but definitely willing to engage more on that. Thanks.
So much. Thank you for that. But before we hand over to the rest of the colleagues, when Crispian spoke, he spoke about the role of public sector as well as the role of private sector. How do you view partnership opportunities between private sector and government in advancing the energy transition agenda?
Audible?
Colleagues, we are really struggling with sound here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so partnerships is critically important to the manner in which we transition. We don't have all the answers. And the transition that we are embarking on is a complete business model change. We're moving from what we know today, which is a coal to liquids, to a power to liquids company. We want to use the same assets, but we are going to fundamentally change it. We can't do this on our own. Given our size in the economy as well as our impact, we're going to need as many role players to help in the transition, not directly with our own physical assets, but in terms of those periphery, much needed enablers to have the transition happen. Policy, we need government to help us on the policy side. We as business, our business, we need incentives. We need those mechanisms and signals from government to put in place low carbon options, to actually direct attention to that. We need infrastructure. I spoke about green hydrogen. When we produce these products, we need the infrastructure, the ports, the roads, to be able to get this out. You need partners to be able to do this. And then we're also not talking about the domestic space. We need to think about international as well. I mean, given where we operate, you mentioned, Vikesh, the emerging markets. Right now in South Africa, these new products in the low carbon future are not cost effective, they're not affordable. So we need international markets. And in that way, you need suppliers, you need off-takers, you need the markets and policies there to also enable you to get these products out with a very specific angle. You want to funnel all of that sort of profits and capital that you generate back into the country so you can effect the transition. So partnerships are critically important, collaboration across a value chain critically important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. You've given us fantastic insight into some of your focal areas and your strategy as well. And well done on that. But let's move on to the Mpumalanga Green Cluster Agency, Nati. If you could enlighten us on your focal areas as you drive the just transition in Mpumalanga. For now, the focal area is getting the mics to work, eh? Yeah.
Okay, looks like it works. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm from the province of Mpumalanga, and obviously, I'm sure some of the ESCOM assets were shown here, just in your presentation. And obviously, all the heavy industry activities that are taking space in our area. Sasol is one of the big companies that are operating in the space. And obviously, there is enormous pressure to the province of Mpumalanga to decarbonize. And in this regard, the government, or rather, we were set up with the support of the provincial government just to operate the interface between government, the private sector, as well as academia. She has alluded to some of the challenges, policy challenges, and those are some of the areas where we are proactive, and we have to work with government with regards to that in terms of, identifying the policy blockages, or rather barriers to economic development, and we work with government with regards to that. However, we have realized that energy is the main issue, is the main concern, and for all the other sectors to thrive, you obviously need the security of supply. Now, with the current challenges in South Africa, we have realized that, when we talk in terms of the just transition, we can not only talk about energy transition, we also need to focus on other areas. And I think some of the colleagues have already alluded to some of those sectors. But of course, as a province that is the food basket of the country, we are an agriculture province. Agriculture is one of those activities that we are aggressively looking at, ramping up those activities. But we are talking here about climate smart agriculture. At the moment, there is a contradiction between agriculture and some of the mining activities. Of course, this is one of the areas where we believe as you lose jobs in other sectors, of course, the agriculture sector has a propensity to create more employment, especially climate smart agriculture. That's one of the areas that we are looking at. We are also a water scarce province. And we have challenges with mine water, we have challenges with some of our river system being polluted, it then becomes important that we address that issue. And we see a lot of economic activities that can be generated out of this aspect. And we believe this water can be used in a circular way, especially in the agriculture sector, but also for other purposes. And the other area which is of importance to us is the circular economy. The circular economy is key. Here we are targeting waste from municipalities, but also targeting waste from industries. So in this regard, we are working with other agencies in the country, especially looking at the industrial symbiosis program, where there's sharing of waste between, companies. And in that way, there's efficient use of resources. And we believe there are quite a number of activities that can accrue out of this. So the last area for us, of course, over and above other things that we are looking at, is this issue of skills development. We can talk, as much as we want, but if we don't focus on the issues of skills, that's a bigger challenge, especially from a province where you have 70% of the youth, where you have 70% of the population being youth. It becomes very important that we really focus on the issues of skills. So for us, that is very, very critical. We are working with tertiary institutions or institutions of higher learning with regards to this aspect. So this is very, very critical. But obviously, other sectors have been mentioned, which are also in the JET-IP, including some of the areas, that relates to e-mobility, the electric vehicles. These are some of the activities that are very important. Green industrialization, green industries. These are some of the issues that we're essentially looking at, but also working with our partner, which is ESCOM in this regard, looking at all these other initiatives that were highlighted here. So all these issues are very, very important for us, and we believe in that regard we'll be able to make an impact in the space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nati. We'll definitely get back to you for your lessons learned as we transition. But it might be a good time for us to move to civil society. Thando, and from the Climate Action Network, if you can help us to understand how can civil society organizations actively engage in shaping and monitoring the energy transition to ensure it is equitable and benefits all South Africans.
Thank you and good afternoon to everyone. So I think number one for us would be participation in both national and local structures. We're already participating at international structure, the PCC, right? The Mpumalanga cluster as well is a local one. That really does help provide a platform for which, as and when ideas, interventions come about, there is a direct channel with which to plug it in. And then we engage as social partners on the efficacy of those ideas. And then hopefully they then can get taken up, right, in the space, which I think is key. The second thing then is a point in which Shaman has already raised, and that is the co-development and collaboration around projects. I think outside of the formal business that ESCOM is in, we also have come to understand that there are people who are dependent on some of these power stations but aren't necessarily employed in the power stations. So how do we then create projects that allow for solar panels in people's rooms, for instance, at a very localized level, so that that energy mix that we speak of at a national level is also applicable at a domestic level? And how can we bring about that? And then the last one, which kind of touches on that point, is then to say something that we do is to develop policy proposals as well. I don't think it's something that happens quite that often from civil society. It's not to say that it's impossible, but it does create a different starting point on a particular issue than would if it comes from a different stakeholder. And so getting involved in that level also helps to create a space where we can, again, engage. And I think the important thing in this thing is a trust-building exercise, right? We want to engage as often as we can, talk about different ideas, and then hopefully those ideas find manifestation in the ultimate end state that we're all wanting to share as different stakeholder groups.
on the just transition. Oh, thank you for that. One of them being leave no one behind. Another one says no engagement about us without us. And you've got extensive experience in engaging at all levels with stakeholders. Can you help us understand what challenges and opportunities do you see for grassroots initiatives in promoting clean energy and balancing the three components of the energy trilemma, being energy security, access and affordability, and energy sustainability?
Okay, so if I can start with this analogy, if a person doesn't have access to electricity, their first target is to gain access to electricity, correct? And then once they have that access, then the next issue becomes, can I afford it continuously? So when we now start to talk about some of the transition things, what has emerged in our deliberations as a sector is that there is very much a support for the transition to renewables. What's important is how we can ensure that in that transition, a person can still afford to pay for the electricity. Because what you don't want to do is to regress from the development gains that we've made, right? And electricity access in South Africa, I don't think won't go down, but affordability of it might become an issue that threatens that. The second thing then is, how do we create projects that can provide some kind of economic diversification opportunities for people? In a space like Komati, Camden, all these other different communities where the power stations are, there has to be other ways in which people can then begin to earn a living outside of being exclusively dependent on a single source, or largely a single source, right? That's the second thing, because again, just a simple example, you're driving into a power station, you're driving into a head office, there are people selling food. But as soon as you close that facility down, what happens to those people who will be buying that food, helping that lady? The third thing is something that I touched on yesterday, is on the subject of hydro. And I'm glad that my colleague Ngosinati from Mpumalanga has raised this one around the water scarcity issue. It's a necessary step to take for us to remain competitive as a country, right? We don't want to lose some of these gains, but we do need to think about how do we balance off the needs of what the country wants and wants to go versus access issues again for people. These things, I mean, I think they go in tandem. It's difficult to say which one is more important than the other one, but it's certainly not going to help us to say, no, one should be prioritized over another one. And it's difficult to set that balance. Sorry, just one more point. No, that's all my points. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Tando. Let's move to Adityani. When I visited your power station in Indonesia, I saw an example of just transition and economic diversification in action. And that was a power station that was manufacturing bricks using ash, right? And that is something that we want to introduce, brick making, road manufacturing from ash, and various products that we can get from the ash value chain. Can you give us other examples in Indonesia of the just component of economic diversification and opportunities that you've identified that we could learn from?
Actually, I'm learning a lot as I'm sitting here, and I don't have anything to offer to answer your question directly, because I feel like we need to broaden our thinking when it comes to just transition activities and opportunities beyond the energy transition industries themselves. I mean, essentially, as a developing nation, Indonesia has to put a mirror in front of itself and admit that there's a lot of socioeconomic fundamentals, inequities beyond energy transition that needs to be addressed to first enhance resilience against economic shocks brought about by the climate crisis and others, and secondly, to have that foundation ready for just transition. And so the activities that you mentioned, the brick making, it adds value for sure, helps diversification, but it's still very much tied to the power industry, right? And it is great that PLN is taking on the responsibility to initiate this. But then I also feel like, and I'm sure, you know, I saw the activities that ESCOM has done here, and I'm saying, wow, ESCOM is doing beyond and above of what it should be actually focusing on, and that is, you know, power generation, transmission, and distribution. I almost want to say that we should be distributing the responsibilities also equally in that sense, because we need to also go beyond the activities that are that are tied to the power sector, and we want to strive for providing communities and individuals with not just opportunities but equal opportunities for them to have the freedom to be able to choose what economic centers they want to build, not just those tied to the power sector. And as I was listening to everyone contributing, I was like, this is really, you know, to address this fundamentally is to address the structural inequities that underpins Indonesia's development. Indonesia, archipelagic nation, but development is heavily concentrated on one island. We have 70% of the population living on one island, and everything is like driven and generated by the capital on that same island. So essentially it's about that, and for provinces and municipalities, for example, to just be so dependent on one natural resource, because obviously, you know, Indonesia is still in a very much resource extraction mode, right? That is also another fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. And so if that is addressed in parallel to generating all of these value-added activities, right, that can, you know, not just have a compounding effect, but that is about really, really addressing the issue of just transition or mitigating unjust transition in the long term and getting us to where we want to be, and that is, you know, moving out of the middle income trap and all. But the second thing that I want to probably to indirectly answer your question is actually to look into opportunities in circular economy, as you've mentioned rightly. And I think that needs to be presented not as a obligation, right, as a burden, but rather as an opportunity to systematically transform local economies, because circularity is really something that needs to happen at the very local level, right? It needs to be very highly localized, contextualized as such. And within, for example, just transition, in the broader context of just transition within the value chain, that means the recycling, in our context, the recycling of batteries, right? The battery recycling industry is something that we're looking at. The ash utilization industry, right? And the fossil fuel derivatives industry, right? I hate to say this, not hate is a strong word, but I used to be one of those, right? Not recognizing the economic and political reality of Indonesia, a fossil fuel rich country. But now I look at it, and now I think I can accept that to some extent, because there is already lock-in, right? And that justifies also looking at circularity within that space, because the lock-in itself, it's going to be really hard to expect that that's going to disappear overnight. So I'm sorry, I'm going way above and beyond of what I think you wanted me to answer.
That's perfect.
But this is a reflection, I guess my reflection as I was listening to all of the amazing panelists here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adityani. And I do acknowledge I put you on the spot. I didn't prepare you for that up front, so thank you. You've done exceptionally well. You spoke about some important points, right? You spoke about it should not be one stakeholder. It should not be ESCOM alone. It should be everybody involved. You also spoke about the importance of the narrative around the transition. And we have 3 minutes left in the session, and it's such a pity because we have such a wealth of experience in front of us. But if I could ask, and let's start from your side, Tando, just to summarize in a minute or less your experiences, and how do you think civil society could effectively communicate the importance of JET to the wider public and to garner support for the energy transition?
The first thing I'd say is access to information. right? Because as we know, there's a lot of knowledge being developed around the subject, and all of us are effectively learning. The access to information in our context means, as Tando sits in a similar platform, to what degree is he sharing this information that he's coming to learn in these spaces? Because the more people understand about what the subject is and where it is that we're wanting to take it and how it might benefit them, the more likely that they will want to jump on board. People have a sense of trepidation on something that they don't understand, and they prefer to rather stay in that little space. So the communication aspect for it has to be able to respond to what I believe are those needs. And one of the things about it is that the more you communicate, it's like a marriage, right? The more you communicate, the more you build trust. Do you communicate less, you're gonna get into problems. So that's the one thing. The second thing is building some kind of a codex, particularly in local languages. You know how many, I've had several instances where people ask me, Tana, what's climate change in Xhosa? You know, how would you explain just transition in Sutu? You know, these are things that don't yet exist, but these words and terms didn't necessarily exist 10, 20, 30 years ago. So they've come and developed over time. So even as we're wanting to bring some of these communities on board, to what extent are we trying to ensure that as we're communicating in a language that is not only in English, but in other languages as well, so that people do understand these things? And then the last thing is, again, I'll just re-emphasize that I think it's important that people understand where the end goal is. What is it that we're trying to achieve by this thing? What is the benefit to you when we get to that end state? Because sometimes people don't see it because they've got other issues, other challenges on a day-to-day basis that hinder them from being able to see these things. It's not to say that they don't have the capacity to, but they're facing other realities that don't allow them to do so. So the communication part speaks to that end state, and it's almost like a visionary exercise, which I think was what I enjoyed the most about how we've gotten to this point, that we spent a lot of time talking about what does that end look like. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tando. Can I check, Nati, if your concluding remarks? Are there any lessons learned that you would like to share regarding the energy transition in Mpumalanga?
Yes, thanks, Vikesh, for that. Yeah, it's been a very difficult journey. But what we have learned thus far is that, there's trust deficit between different stakeholders. There's trust deficit between government and the private sector. There's trust deficit between communities and government and the private sector. So what becomes important here is that engagement are very, very important. And I'll think I'm just emphasizing on what he said. Stakeholder engagement is very, very crucial. The second issue that we have picked up is that institutional arrangements are very, very important. At the moment, at the province, we have started a process of putting those institutional arrangements in place so that you know who's supposed to do what in the just transition. That's very, very critical. The last one, of course, is aligning policy with climate targets. It's very, very pertinent, and this should be done. In South Africa, we know that government at national level has done well in this aspect, but it also becomes important for provinces, maybe, to align with those climate targets. So those are some of the issues that we have picked up in the space that we work on, but also the issue of transparency. I think it was highlighted, very, very critical. There should be transparency in everything that we do, and that assists a great deal. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Same question to you, Shamini. What are the lessons learned that you would like to share with the colleagues?
There's so many, but I think the thing that stands out for me the most is the fact that through the PCC, we've been engaging quite extensively. And in that process, the awareness of the just transition is far greater than it was perhaps 2 years ago. And in acknowledging that, the one thing that we as a company have taken away is the idea that we have to listen a lot more. and listening, because people do know what they want. And if you listen closely enough, you will get that nuggets of information about what to do. But to be able to get there, you need to be able to listen, build the trust, hear people out, and then start co-creating together. You know, I've been speaking a lot to Thando, and this climate change community is quite small, and we chat quite a bit. And he often says to me, meaningful consultation, meaningful co-creation. We need to speak to everyone that has information to share in this space, and we need to bring it to bear in our own processes, and we need to talk to all sectors of society, and that's something that we've learned. So we're taking the time in developing our plan. Stakeholder engagement is so critically important, but it's not the engagement that we used to. It's not public participation. This is co-creation, and I think the listening part is so critically important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And then finally, Dr. Oliver, when you opened Chamonix, the mic, please. Okay.
This also works.
Yeah.
Chair, I know Thando Lokoko as a firebrand community activist, and I want to know what you've done to him that he has been so measured and considered and careful with his inputs. No, but final reflections. There are a lot of people that are going around this conference saying that just transition is a distraction from the core ambition of cutting emissions. And I think that's a false juxtaposition. There's not a trade-off between justice and ambition. In fact, for us, certainly looking at this through a developing country lens, if the transition is not just and does not bring people along, we will never achieve the levels of ambition that we need to get to net zero by 2050. So to me, they're one and part and parcel of the same thing. They're the two sides of the same coin. And specifically in an energy context, I like the framing that the energy trilemma gives. So it talks about energy security, reliability, energy access, equity, and affordability, and energy sustainability, decarbonizing the energy system. And I think that's a very useful framing, and it's a very useful way of thinking about Eskom's own transition. So, yeah, justice and ambition go hand in hand. The one enables the other. We should resist strongly attempts at this conference to water it down.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. From our side, the need to start early with investments from a repurposing and repowering perspective, the need to have active and robust engagements with stakeholders at all levels, and to do that upfront cannot be overemphasized. Importantly, we often hear about people talking about this, the transition is, or the speed of the transition, and it's going on along too quickly. And I think it's actually going along too slowly, honestly. I think there's a lot more that we need to do, there's a lot more that we can do, and not just from an energy perspective, but from an economic diversification and economic employment opportunity perspective. The opportunities are vast. And I want to thank the distinguished colleagues at the panel. And thank you all for your time and your patience as well. We are slightly over, but thank you again. And just join me in thanking them. Thank you.